There's a mystery that sits in dusty archives and crumbling tablets, carved into temple walls and whispered through oral traditions spanning thousands of years. It's a mystery that professional historians don't like talking about at dinner parties because they can't explain it. And here it is. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that never traded, never communicated, never even knew the other existed, all tell the same story. The world ended. Water rose, fire fell, darkness came, and only a handful of humans survived. The ancient Sumerians, writing on clay tablets in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago, described a great flood sent by the gods that destroyed humanity. Only Utnapishtim and his family survived on a massive boat. In Central America, the Mayans recorded multiple destructions of the world, including one by a great flood that turned humans into fish. Across the Pacific, Aboriginal Australians have dreamtime stories of a massive flood that reshaped the land and forced their ancestors to flee to the mountains. In China, the Great Flood of Gun Yu is described as a world-covering deluge that took decades to control. And in Scandinavia, Norse mythology speaks of Ragnarok, when the seas will rise and consume the earth. Different continents, different languages, different gods, same story. Now, you might be thinking, okay, floods happen, people live near water, rivers overflow. Of course, ancient cultures would have flood stories. That's the rational explanation, the one that lets us sleep comfortably at night. But here's the problem. These aren't just stories about bad storms or rivers overflowing. They're stories about the entire world being destroyed, about humanity being reduced to a handful of survivors, about a catastrophe so severe it resets civilization itself. And the details, when you actually read the ancient texts, are disturbingly specific. The Sumerian account says the flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. The biblical version in Genesis, which borrowed heavily from earlier Mesopotamian sources, says 40 days. The Greek account of Deucalion's flood says 9 days. Hindu texts describe a flood that lasted 1 solar year. Different numbers, sure, but all describing an extended catastrophe, not a single storm. Even more unsettling, many of these stories include warnings. Someone knew it was coming. In the Sumerian version, the god Enki warns Utnapishtim. In the biblical account, God warns Noah. In Greek mythology, Prometheus warns his son Deucalion. In Hindu tradition, the fish avatar of Vishnu warns Manu. Over and over, the same narrative structure: warning, preparation, survival, restart. So, what are we looking at here? 3 possibilities, and historians fight about this endlessly. First option, pure coincidence. Humans everywhere independently invented similar catastrophe myths, because that's just how human psychology works. We fear annihilation, so we create stories about it. Second option, these stories reflect common psychological archetypes, universal patterns in how humans process trauma and imagine disasters. Carl Jung would love this explanation. Third option, the one that makes academics nervous. These stories are memories, distorted, mythologized, passed down through hundreds of generations, but fundamentally rooted in something that actually happened. If you're listening to this in bed somewhere, do me a favor and drop a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I read these, and there's something surreal about knowing people are falling asleep to ancient catastrophes in Tokyo at sunrise and London at midnight, all at once. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to follow this thread wherever it leads. We'll dig into the ancient texts themselves, not the sanitized versions you learned in school, but the original accounts with all their strange, specific, uncomfortable details. We'll look at geological evidence that's forcing scientists to reconsider what they thought they knew about Earth's recent history. We'll explore theories that mainstream academia won't touch with a 10-foot pole, and we'll ask the question that keeps researchers up at night. What if our ancestors weren't making this up? What if they were trying to warn us about something that could happen again? The Sumerians had a word for the time before the flood. They called it the antediluvian period, the time before the waters came, and according to their king lists, humans lived for thousands of years back then. Cities existed that we've never found. Knowledge existed that was lost when the waters rose. So let's start with the flood itself, the one that shows up everywhere. Because once you see the patterns, you can't unsee them. Every schoolchild knows the story of Noah. An old man builds an impossible boat because God tells him the world is about to end. Animals march aboard 2 by 2. Rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. The entire world floods. Everything dies except what's on the ark. When the waters recede, humanity gets a second chance. It's a nice story. Religious people take it as divine truth. Skeptics dismiss it as ancient mythology. But here's what both groups tend to overlook. The Noah story isn't unique. It isn't even original. It's just the most famous version of a story that appears in virtually every ancient culture on Earth. And when you start examining these accounts side by side, you realize something deeply unsettling. They're not just similar. They're often identical in ways that coincidence simply cannot explain. Let's start with the Epic of Gilgamesh. This Mesopotamian text predates the Bible by over 1,000 years, maybe more. The oldest fragments we've found date to around 2100 BCE, but the story itself is probably even older, passed down orally for generations before anyone thought to write it down. And right there in the middle of this ancient epic you find the flood story. But it's not called Noah, it's called Utnapishtim. The similarities are impossible to ignore, a divine warning that humanity will be destroyed by flooding. One man chosen to survive, instructions to build a massive boat and fill it with animals, a catastrophic flood that covers the entire known world. Birds sent out to search for dry land. The boat coming to rest on a mountain when the waters recede. An offering of thanksgiving to the gods. Even the number of days has parallels. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes 6 days and 6 nights of flooding, while Genesis describes 40 days and 40 nights. Different numbers, but the same basic structure. A limited period of catastrophic rainfall followed by months of slowly receding water. Now, you could argue that the biblical authors borrowed from Gilgamesh. That's the standard academic explanation. The Hebrews were in Babylon during the exile. They heard local flood myths. They adapted one for their own religious purposes. Clean, simple, case closed. Except that explanation completely falls apart when you look at flood myths from cultures that had zero contact with Mesopotamia or the Middle East. Cultures that were geographically isolated for thousands of years before anyone started comparing stories. Take India. Hindu texts describe a flood myth involving Manu, the first man, and Matsya, a fish avatar of the god Vishnu. According to the story, a tiny fish asks Manu for protection. Manu puts the fish in a jar, but it grows rapidly, forcing him to transfer it first to a larger vessel, then to a river, then to the ocean. Eventually the fish reveals itself as Vishnu, and warns Manu that a great flood will destroy all life on earth. Vishnu tells him to build a boat and save seeds of every plant and pairs of every animal. The flood comes. Everything is destroyed. Manu's boat survives, guided by the massive fish through the raging waters. When the flood recedes, Manu releases the animals and plants, repopulating the earth. Different gods, different details, but the core structure is identical. Divine warning, chosen survivor, boat full of animals and seeds, total destruction. Humanity gets a second chance. This story appears in texts dating back at least 3,000 years, but the oral tradition is certainly much older, and India had minimal contact with Mesopotamia during the period when these stories would have been formed. So how did two geographically separate cultures develop nearly identical flood myths? Maybe it's still coincidence. Two cultures, two floods. But then you look at ancient Greece, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus becomes angry with humanity's corruption and decides to destroy the world with a massive flood. Prometheus, the titan who had given humans fire, warns his son Deucalion about the coming disaster. Deucalion builds a chest, essentially a boat, and takes shelter inside with his wife Pyrrha. The flood comes, everything drowns. After 9 days and nights, the waters recede. The chest comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerge as the only survivors. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. Again, the core elements are identical. Divine anger, warning to one good man, boat or protective vessel. Total destruction by flood. A specific mountain where the survivors come to rest. Repopulation of the earth. The Greeks had their own unique spin on the ending, but the fundamental story structure is the same as Mesopotamia and India. 3 ancient civilizations, 3 flood myths, all featuring suspiciously similar details. But let's go further east. Ancient China has multiple flood myths, but the most prominent involves a hero named Gun and his son Yu the Great. The story describes a catastrophic flood that covered the earth during the reign of Emperor Yao. The waters were so vast and destructive that they threatened to wipe out all of humanity. Gun attempted to stop the flooding by building dams and barriers, but failed. His son Yu took a different approach, dredging channels and creating waterways to drain the floodwaters. After 13 years of work, Yu finally succeeded in making the land habitable again. Humanity survived, but just barely. This version focuses more on the engineering response than the boat, but the core is still there. Worldwide flooding, near extinction of humanity, a chosen hero who saves civilization. And the Chinese flood myths describe this as a global event, not a local disaster. The waters covered mountains. They threatened all human life. The timescale alone, 13 years of flooding, suggests a catastrophe of unimaginable scope. Now you might argue that these are all agrarian civilizations living near major rivers. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates. India had the Indus and Ganges. Greece had regular flooding in its valleys. China had the Yellow River, which flooded catastrophically many times throughout history. So maybe these cultures all experienced devastating local floods and mythologized them into world-ending events. That's a reasonable hypothesis, until you look at cultures that lived nowhere near major rivers, cultures that inhabited coastlines, mountains, and islands, and you find the exact same stories. Aboriginal Australians have flood myths that are particularly remarkable because they appear to preserve actual geological history. Multiple Aboriginal groups across different parts of Australia tell stories of a time when the sea levels were much lower, when you could walk to places that are now islands, when the coastline looked completely different than it does today. Then the waters rose, not gradually but catastrophically in some accounts. Entire landscapes were drowned. People fled to higher ground. Many died. The survivors passed down stories of the world that existed before the flood. What makes these stories extraordinary is that modern geology confirms them. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose by over 400 feet as massive ice sheets melted. This wasn't a gradual process that humans would barely notice. Archaeological evidence suggests periods of rapid sea level rise, sometimes several meters per century. For coastal populations, this would have been catastrophic. Entire territories drowned within a few generations. Places where people had lived for thousands of years simply vanished beneath the waves. Some Aboriginal flood stories have been dated through geographical analysis. They describe specific landmarks that were last above water 10,000 years ago or more. This means these oral traditions have been maintained for at least 10 millennia, possibly longer. That's older than any written civilization, older than the pyramids, older than Mesopotamia. These are memories from the deep past, preserved with remarkable accuracy through hundreds of generations. And Aboriginal Australians aren't unique in this. Pacific Islander cultures throughout Polynesia and Melanesia have flood stories. Many describe a time when islands were larger or connected, then the seas rose and separated them. Some stories describe specific channels between islands that geological surveys confirm were above water during the Ice Age. These aren't vague myths. They're geographical records preserved in oral tradition. Native American cultures across both continents have flood stories. The Ojibwe people tell of a great flood survived only by a man who floated on a log with various animals. The Aztecs believed they were living in the fifth sun, the fifth iteration of the world, and that the previous world had been destroyed by flooding. Mayan texts describe multiple cycles of creation and destruction, with flooding as a recurring theme. South American cultures from the Andes to the Amazon have their own versions, often featuring a survivor who repopulates the earth with the help of divine beings. Africa, beyond Egypt, has flood traditions among numerous cultures. The Yoruba people of West Africa tell of a flood sent by the supreme deity. The Maasai have flood stories. The San people of southern Africa have them. Even in Europe, beyond the classical Greek myths, Celtic and Norse traditions include catastrophic flooding among their tales of destruction and renewal. Now here's where it gets statistically interesting. When you map all these flood myths, you're looking at hundreds of independent cultures spread across 6 continents. Many of these cultures had zero contact with each other until modern times. The Aboriginal Australians were isolated for at least 40,000 years. Many Native American groups had no contact with Old World civilizations until European colonization. Pacific Islanders developed their cultures independently, yet somehow they all remembered the same basic story. A great flood, near total destruction, a handful of survivors, humanity given another chance. The probability of this being pure coincidence is effectively zero. Either these cultures all experienced devastating floods independently and all decided to mythologize them in nearly identical ways, or they're all remembering the same event. One catastrophic episode of flooding so severe, so traumatic, that every surviving culture preserved the memory and passed it down for thousands of years. The mainstream explanation is that these are all memories of local floods, exaggerated over time and transformed into universal myths. But that explanation requires you to believe that hundreds of independent cultures, isolated from each other by oceans and continents, all experienced similar local disasters, and all chose to describe them in suspiciously similar ways. Chosen survivors, divine warnings, boats or rafts loaded with animals, waters covering mountains, humanity nearly wiped out, specific numbers of days, landing on high peaks, repopulation. These aren't general themes. These are specific plot points appearing again and again in cultures that supposedly never communicated. The other explanation is simpler but more unsettling. Something happened. Something real. Something catastrophic. Something that involved water on a scale we can barely imagine today. And the survivors, scattered across the world, isolated from each other, all told their children the same story. The world drowned. Almost everyone died. We barely survived, and we must never forget. The flood stories are dramatic enough. Civilizations drowned, humanity nearly wiped out, survivors clinging to mountaintops and boats. But there's another pattern in ancient memory that's even more disturbing, one that appears in cultures so separated by time and distance that their connection seems impossible. It's the memory of darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, not spiritual darkness, Actual physical darkness that covered the earth and nearly killed everything. The Norse called it Fimbul Winter, the great winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. But here's what most people miss. Fimbul Winter wasn't just cold, it was dark. The sources describe 3 winters in succession with no summer between them. The sun would lose its power, becoming dim and weak. Snow would fall from every direction. The world would be frozen and dark, and humanity would tear itself apart fighting over the last scraps of food. Families would betray each other. The bonds that held society together would dissolve. Nearly everyone would die. 3 years of darkness and cold. 3 years when the sun barely showed itself. 3 years that reduced humanity to its most desperate state. Now travel south to ancient Egypt. The mythology there preserves something remarkably similar, though told in their own symbolic language. The stories speak of times when Ra, the sun god, withdrew his light from the world. When he became angry or weakened, darkness would descend upon the earth. The crops would fail. The Nile would become unreliable. Chaos would spread across the land. In some versions, Ra ages and becomes weak, his light fading, his power diminishing. In others, he literally withdraws into the underworld, abandoning humanity to darkness and death. The priests would perform elaborate rituals to bring him back, to restore the light, to save humanity from extinction. These weren't just religious stories. The Egyptian texts describe specific consequences of the darkness: famine, disease, social collapse. They describe the world becoming cold even in Egypt. They describe a time when the natural order of things broke down completely. The Aztecs preserve something even more specific. Their mythology divides history into ages, each ending in catastrophe. One of these ages, the Age of Darkness, ended when the sun disappeared entirely. Not gradually, not symbolically. It vanished. The world was plunged into absolute darkness and unbearable cold. The few humans who survived did so by hiding in caves and eating whatever they could find in the blackness. Most died of starvation or cold. The survivors emerged changed, traumatized, carrying the memory of that terrible time into the next age. The Aztec texts specify that this darkness lasted for years, that when the sun finally returned, it was weak at first, barely providing warmth, that it took time for the world to recover, for plants to grow again, for animals to return, for life to become sustainable once more. Move north to Finland. The Kalevala, their national epic, preserves remarkably similar memories. The story tells of a time when the sun and moon were stolen from the sky. Not metaphorically stolen, actually removed, hidden away in a cave or deep in the earth. The world descended into darkness and cold. Heroes had to embark on desperate quests to recover the sources of light. Without the sun, nothing could grow. Lakes froze solid. Animals disappeared or died. Humanity faced extinction in the endless night. The stories emphasize the cold, the darkness, the desperation of people trying to survive when the fundamental source of life had been taken away. In China, ancient texts describe a time when the sky itself cracked, when the pillars that held up the heavens collapsed. Darkness fell across the earth. Fire rained down in some places while others froze. The cosmic order that maintained the world fell into chaos. The goddess Nuwa had to repair the sky, literally patching the cracks to restore light and order. But before she succeeded, humanity suffered terribly. The texts describe years of darkness, cold, and starvation. Populations reduced to tiny groups of survivors. Knowledge and civilization nearly lost. What's striking is how specific these Chinese accounts are. They don't just say the sky cracked symbolically. They describe physical effects, portions of the sky going dark, the sun appearing in the wrong places or not appearing at all, the seasons becoming confused and unreliable, And crucially, they describe this happening not in mythical prehistory, but in a time when humans existed, suffered, and barely survived. Cross the Pacific to North America. Dozens of Native American tribes, separated by thousands of miles and with no contact with each other, preserve stories of the long night. The Cherokee speak of a time when the sun disappeared and the world went cold and dark. The few survivors had to rely on fire and whatever food they'd stored. Most people died. The Inuit tell of a great darkness that lasted for months or years when the sun refused to rise. The Hopi describe an age that ended when the sky went dark and the world froze. Tribe after tribe from the Arctic to the southwest preserves memories of extended darkness that nearly ended humanity. These aren't vague myths. Many of these stories include specific details: how people tried to survive in the darkness, how they rationed food, how they kept fires burning continuously, how children were prioritized for the limited resources, how the old sometimes chose to die so the young might live. These are the details of actual survival, of real trauma, of experiences so profound they were remembered and retold for thousands of years. The pattern is undeniable once you see it. Something blocked the sun. Something caused extended darkness and cold across the entire planet. Something that happened not in the distant past when only myths were recorded, but recently enough that human memory preserved specific details of the suffering and survival. The cultures describing this event are too separated to have influenced each other. Norse tribes in Scandinavia had no contact with Aztecs in Central America. Ancient Egyptians didn't share stories with Finnish shamans. Chinese dynasties didn't trade myths with Cherokee bands. Yet they all remember the same thing. The sun disappeared or weakened. Darkness covered the earth. Cold descended even in places that should have been warm. Crops failed. Animals died. Humanity was reduced to small groups of desperate survivors, fighting to stay alive in an endless night. And after years of suffering, the sun slowly returned. Life gradually recovered. But the memory of that darkness never faded. It was carved into stone, woven into epics, chanted in ceremonies, passed from generation to generation. A warning, maybe, or simply a testament to what our ancestors endured, to the fact that they survived when survival seemed impossible. The question modern historians struggle with is simple but profound. What could cause global darkness severe enough to be remembered independently by cultures across every continent? What natural event could block out the sun for years, bring cold to the entire planet, and push humanity to the edge of extinction? The answers, when we look at them honestly, are disturbing, and they force us to reconsider everything we think we know about our past. Of all the catastrophic events remembered by ancient peoples, perhaps none is described with more visceral terror than fire falling from the sky. Not ordinary fire. Not lightning strikes or forest blazes that anyone living in the ancient world would have seen dozens of times. Something else. Something that burned entire cities, scorched vast landscapes, and left survivors so traumatized that their descendants told the stories for thousands of years. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah is probably the most famous example. According to Genesis, God rained burning sulfur down on these cities, utterly destroying them and everyone in them. The description is specific. Brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. The earth itself becoming so hot that when Lot's wife looked back, she turned into a pillar of salt, which some researchers interpret as a poetic description of instant incineration or petrification from extreme heat. Modern scholars have spent decades trying to rationalize this story. Maybe it was a volcanic eruption, though there are no volcanoes in that region. Maybe it was an earthquake that ignited natural gas deposits. Maybe it was just moral allegory, never meant to be taken literally. But here's the problem. Stories of fire raining from the heavens don't just appear in the Bible, they appear everywhere, in cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and millennia, describing the same impossible thing. The ancient Greeks told of Phaethon, the son of Helios, the sun god. Young and reckless, Phaethon convinced his father to let him drive the solar chariot across the sky for a single day. But the horses were too powerful, the chariot too difficult to control. Phaethon lost his grip on the reins, and the sun plunged toward earth, scorching everything beneath it. Rivers dried up. Forests burst into flames. Entire populations were burned alive. The earth itself cracked open from the heat. Finally, Zeus had to strike Phaethon down with a thunderbolt to stop the destruction. But by then, vast regions of the world had been reduced to ash and desert. Greek myths are often dismissed as pure fantasy, creative explanations for natural phenomena that ancient people didn't understand. But the Phaethon story is oddly specific. It describes not just heat, but a moving source of heat sweeping across the landscape. It describes global devastation, not just a local disaster. And it describes the sky itself becoming dangerous, something that had never happened before and has never happened since in human memory. Move east to ancient Persia, and you find the Zoroastrian text describing something remarkably similar. The Bunda-Hishn, one of the most important Zoroastrian scriptures, tells of a cosmic fire that will one day cleanse the world. But more interesting are the references to a fire that already happened in the distant past. A conflagration that fell from the heavens and purified the earth through destruction. The texts describe molten metal flowing over the world, burning away impurity, rivers of fire covering the land, mountains melting, the righteous somehow surviving while the wicked are consumed. These aren't vague metaphors, they're detailed accounts of a specific type of catastrophe. Fire from above, not from below, heat so intense it melted rock, destruction so widespread it seemed to engulf the entire world. Australian Aboriginal peoples, isolated from European, Asian and Middle Eastern cultures for at least 50,000 years, have their own versions. The Yolngu people of Northern Australia tell of a time when fire fell from the stars, burning the land and forcing their ancestors to hide in caves and underwater. The Kamilaroi people describe celestial serpents that dropped burning coals onto the earth, setting the forests ablaze and boiling the rivers. These aren't recent stories influenced by contact with Western cultures. They're ancient, embedded in song cycles that date back thousands of years. Cross the Pacific to Mesoamerica, and the pattern continues. The Aztec believed the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before the current age. The 4th age, they said, ended in rain of fire. Not metaphorical fire, actual flames falling from the sky like rain, consuming everything. The few survivors hid in caves and emerged to find a world transformed, blackened and empty. The Aztec calendar stone, that massive carved disc that tourists photograph in Mexico City, includes symbols representing this age of fire, depicting flames falling from above while humans flee in terror below. The Maya told similar stories. In the Popol Vuh, their sacred text, they describe an age ending when a great rain of resin fell from the sky, destroying the wooden people who inhabited the earth at that time. Resin that burned, that stuck to skin and couldn't be removed. That fell in such quantities it covered the entire world. Modern translators struggle with these passages because they seem to describe something like napalm, a burning sticky substance that falls from above, which shouldn't be possible in a pre-industrial world. Travel to India and the ancient texts become even more disturbing. The Mahabharata, that vast epic of war and gods, includes passages describing weapons of the gods that rain fire from the heavens. The Brahmastra, a divine weapon so terrible it could destroy entire armies, is described as creating a pillar of fire and smoke reaching up to the heavens. Trees burst into flames, rivers boiled, warriors and their horses were burned to ashes where they stood. The ground itself became scorched and barren for years afterward. Some researchers have noted the descriptions sound remarkably like nuclear weapons. Heat that burns through armor, light brighter than the sun, delayed deaths among survivors, contaminated ground where nothing will grow. It's uncomfortable reading because it feels too specific, too detailed to be pure imagination. Yet these texts were written thousands of years before humanity split the atom. So what actually happened? What could cause cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years to remember the same specific catastrophe? Fire falling from above, heat so intense it transformed landscapes, destruction so complete it seemed like the end of the world. The rational explanations don't quite work. Volcanic eruptions produce ash and lava, but they're localized. Forest fires spread across land, but they don't fall from the sky. Lightning strikes, but it doesn't rain burning material over vast regions. Meteor impacts can certainly produce heat and fire, but they're instantaneous explosions, not sustained rains of flame. Yet every ancient culture that left written or oral records describes this. Fire from the heavens, not once, but as a world-changing event that marked a boundary between ages. An event so catastrophic that surviving it became the defining story of human civilization. The geological record doesn't lie. It can't. Rock layers, sediment deposits, isotope ratios, they're the Earth's memory, written in a language that existed long before humans learned to speak. And for the past several decades, that record has been telling us something that makes a lot of scientists very uncomfortable. Something catastrophic happened approximately 12,800 years ago. Something that fits almost perfectly with the timeline of those ancient flood stories we've been discussing. For most of the 20th century, geology was dominated by a principle called uniformitarianism. The idea that geological processes happen slowly, gradually, over immense spans of time. Mountains rise millimeter by millimeter. Canyons form grain by grain. Everything changes, but it changes so slowly that you'd never notice in a human lifetime. This wasn't just scientific theory, it was almost religious doctrine. Suggest that catastrophes could reshape the earth quickly, and you'd be laughed out of the academic establishment. Catastrophism was considered outdated, unscientific, the realm of religious fundamentalists and fringe theorists. But the evidence doesn't care about academic politics. And the evidence has been mounting for decades that something absolutely catastrophic happened at the end of the last ice age. The period is called the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic wildflower that suddenly appears in the geological record across Europe, and it represents one of the most dramatic climate reversals in Earth's recent history. For context, the planet had been warming for thousands of years. The Great Ice Age glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, the climate was becoming more hospitable. Human populations were expanding, developing agriculture, building the first permanent settlements. Then, 12,800 years ago, everything went wrong. Temperatures plummeted, not gradually over centuries, but dramatically within decades, maybe even years. Some ice cores suggest the shift happened in less than a decade. The northern hemisphere was thrown back into full glacial conditions almost overnight. Glaciers that had been retreating for millennia suddenly began advancing again. Forests died, megafauna populations collapsed, and humanity, which had been thriving, was thrown into a survival crisis that would last 1,200 years. This isn't speculation. The evidence appears in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment layers across North America and Europe, in pollen records that show the sudden disappearance of temperate plant species and their replacement with cold-adapted tundra vegetation. The Younger Dryas was real, it was sudden, and it was catastrophic. But what caused it? For years, the mainstream explanation was that melting glaciers dumped massive amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and triggering the cooling event. It's a reasonable hypothesis. Ocean currents do regulate global climate, disrupt them, and you could trigger rapid cooling. But there's a problem. That hypothesis doesn't explain everything we're finding in the geological record. It doesn't explain the layer of microscopic diamonds that appears at the Younger Dryas boundary in sediment cores across multiple continents. It doesn't explain the shocked quartz, the platinum anomalies, the magnetic microspherules. It doesn't explain the widespread evidence of massive wildfires occurring simultaneously across vast regions. These are the fingerprints of something else entirely. These are the signatures of cosmic impact. In the early 2000s, a group of scientists proposed something radical, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They suggested that approximately 12,800 years ago the Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet. Not a single impact, but multiple airbursts and impacts across the northern hemisphere. The evidence they presented was compelling. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamond particles that only form under extreme pressure and temperature conditions, show up in sediment layers dated to exactly the Younger Dryas boundary. These aren't rare, isolated findings. They appear in sediment cores from dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia. Shocked quartz, another indicator of extreme impact events, appears in the same layers. So does a thin layer of carbon-rich material consistent with massive wildfires. So do platinum anomalies similar to those found at the impact layer that killed the dinosaurs. The pattern is consistent with what you'd expect if multiple comet fragments exploded over the northern ice sheets and continental land masses. The impacts would have instantly vaporized sections of the ice sheet, sending unimaginable quantities of water vapor and melted ice into the atmosphere. They would have ignited continental-scale wildfires as superheated debris rained down across vast regions. They would have injected massive amounts of dust and aerosols into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid global cooling. And they would have caused something else: flooding, catastrophic, biblical-scale flooding. Because those ice sheets weren't just melting gradually. They were being destroyed explosively. Consider the Missoula floods. These are geological fact, not theory. At the end of the last ice age, an ice dam in what's now Montana failed repeatedly, releasing a lake the size of Lake Ontario in a matter of days. Each flood sent water cascading across the Pacific Northwest with such force that it scoured the landscape down to bedrock. Boulders the size of houses were carried hundreds of miles. Valleys were carved in hours that would normally take millennia to form. The floodwaters were moving at 65 miles per hour in some places, carrying more than 10 times the flow of all current rivers on Earth combined. And that was just one ice dam, failing multiple times over several thousand years. Now imagine similar events happening simultaneously across the northern ice sheets, triggered by cosmic impacts. Imagine ice dams the size of mountain ranges failing all at once. The amount of water released would have been almost incomprehensible. Sea levels didn't just rise gradually at the end of the Ice Age, they rose catastrophically in pulses. The geological evidence shows that global sea levels rose approximately 400 feet between the peak of the Ice Age and the beginning of the current warm period. But that rise wasn't steady. There were periods of rapid increase, episodes where sea levels jumped dozens of feet in just a few decades. One of these pulses coincides almost exactly with the Younger Dryas boundary. If there were coastal civilizations, settlements built along the Ice Age shorelines when sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, they would have been completely inundated. Not slowly, over generations, but potentially within a single human lifetime. Every coastal city, every port, every lowland settlement would have been drowned. Only those people living in highland areas would have survived to tell the tale, and they would have described it exactly as the ancient texts describe. Waters rising to cover the mountains, the world drowning, humanity nearly wiped out. For years, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was dismissed by mainstream science. Too catastrophic, too dramatic, too much like those outdated ideas about sudden changes. But the evidence keeps mounting. More impact markers are found. More sites show the same pattern. More scientists are quietly reconsidering whether maybe, just maybe, catastrophism deserves another look. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The Earth has been hit by cosmic debris before, and it will be hit again. The only question is when and how big. And if it happened 12,800 years ago, if it triggered exactly the kind of global catastrophe that ancient humans described in remarkably consistent detail, then maybe those flood myths aren't myths at all. Maybe they're memories, traumatic, persistent memories of the worst disaster humanity has ever faced. Memories important enough that every surviving culture made absolutely certain they would never be forgotten. So now we arrive at one of the most controversial ideas in modern archaeology. The claim that before all these floods, fires and falling skies, there was something else, a civilization, advanced, global, and almost completely erased. No one has pushed this idea into popular conversation harder than writer Graham Hancock. His hypothesis is simple, but explosive. He suggests that during the last ice age, long before Sumer, Egypt, or the Maya, there may have been a sophisticated culture living along the now drowned coastlines of the world. A civilization that understood the stars, built with stone on a monumental scale, maybe even mapped the globe. And when the world-ending event hit at the end of the Ice Age, this civilization was destroyed, leaving behind only scattered survivors and fragmentary memories. Mainstream archaeologists don't accept this. They argue that we see no clear evidence of cities, writing systems, large-scale agriculture, or the kind of infrastructure you'd expect from an advanced civilization. From their perspective, Hancock is connecting dots that aren't really connected, seeing patterns where there are only coincidences. But the debate doesn't go away because a handful of discoveries sit there like loose threads begging to be pulled. Göbekli Tepe is one of those threads. On a windswept hill in southeastern Turkey, under layers of soil that hid it for thousands of years, stands a site that shouldn't exist, at least not when it does. Radiocarbon dates place the earliest levels of Göbekli Tepe at around 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. That's before pottery, before domesticated grains in that region, before the first cities. According to the standard timeline, humans then were still supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following herds, and making relatively modest stone tools. And yet at Göbekli Tepe, you find massive T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 or more tons, carefully quarried, transported, and set upright in circular enclosures. The pillars are carved with foxes, birds, snakes, wild boar, scorpions, and abstract symbols that may represent constellations, clan markers, or something we can't even guess at. The planning alone would have required complex organization, quarry workers, stone carvers, laborers, maybe architects or ritual specialists. The site seems to have been deliberately buried after centuries of use, almost like a conscious attempt to hide or preserve it. This is what unsettles archaeologists. For decades, the story went like this. First agriculture, then surplus, then specialization, then temples and monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe flips the script. It looks like people built the temple first, then settled down. Religion or ritual may have come before farming, not after. For Hancock and others, this is a smoking gun. They argue that Göbekli Tepe might not be the beginning, but the echo of something older, a project built by survivors of a lost culture, trying to rekindle what they once had. Then there's the Sphinx. On the Giza Plateau, in front of the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx lies partly carved from the bedrock, partly built from blocks. Officially, it dates to around 4,500 years ago, to the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. But in the early 1990s, a handful of researchers argued that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx and its enclosure don't match the dry, wind-driven erosion you'd expect from the last few thousand years of desert climate. Instead, they claim the Sphinx shows signs of heavy rainfall erosion, rounded grooves, vertical channels, patterns that suggest long periods of intense precipitation. The problem is, Egypt hasn't had that kind of sustained heavy rainfall since the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. If that interpretation is correct, and this is a big if, it implies that the core of the Sphinx might be far older than the pyramids around it. Maybe the body was carved in a wetter, earlier epoch, and the head recarved later into its current pharaonic form. Mainstream geologists and Egyptologists dispute this. They argue that wind, salt crystallization, and localized runoff can mimic the patterns described as rain erosion. To them, the Sphinx fits comfortably in the Old Kingdom, but the controversy refuses to die, because it touches the same question as Göbekli Tepe. Did someone somewhere know how to work stone on a monumental scale long before our textbooks say they did? If the coastlines really did drown at the end of the last ice age, then much of that hypothetical civilization would now lie underwater. And in shallow seas all around the world, we find structures that stir the imagination. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, divers discovered stepped terraces and flat platforms descending into the depths. Some features look uncannily like stairways, walls, and plazas. The rock breaks in straight geometric lines, forming right angles and pillars. Are these the remains of an artificial complex submerged around the time sea levels rose? Or are they natural sandstone formations shaped by tectonics and erosion, merely resembling buildings to our pattern-hungry brains? Marine geologists remain divided. Many lean toward a natural explanation, pointing to similar formations on land that no one claims are man-made. Others insist certain cuts and alignments look too deliberate to be coincidence. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys have revealed what appear to be rectilinear patterns on the seafloor, and divers have recovered artifacts from the area. Some researchers argue these might be traces of ancient urban layouts, flooded as seas rose at the end of the Ice Age. Critics respond that the dating of artifacts and sediments is uncertain, and that rivers can scatter objects far from their original context. Once again, the evidence hovers in a grey zone between tantalizing and inconclusive. In the Mediterranean, near places like Pavlopetri in Greece and Atlit Yam off Israel, we do find genuine submerged settlements, thousands of years old. We know for certain that rising seas swallowed coastal villages in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. These are not lost high-tech cities, but they are proof of a simple fact. The ocean does erase human history. Coastlines move. Entire communities vanish beneath the waves, and whatever lay along the shorelines of the world 12,000 or 20,000 years ago is now hidden under hundreds of feet of water, difficult and expensive to explore. When you combine all of this with the universal disaster myths, the floods, the fires, the darkened skies, it raises a possibility. Maybe these weren't just imaginative stories invented to explain thunderstorms or seasonal changes. Maybe they were memories, fading recollections of real events told and retold around campfires, passed down for hundreds of generations, drifting across languages and continents, but keeping the same core. There was a world before, it was destroyed, and a few people survived. For many academics, this line of thinking crosses from careful inference into speculation, and they're right to be cautious. Extraordinary claims require strong evidence, not just narrative coherence or emotional appeal. Archaeology is a slow science. It depends on fragments, careful dating, and replication of results. Researchers worry, with good reason, that dramatic stories about lost civilizations can overshadow the real, hard-won discoveries being made every year about known cultures. But there is also another side. The politics of archaeology are real. Funding tends to flow toward established sites and accepted questions. Radical hypotheses can be career risks. Young scholars quickly learn which ideas are safe to pursue and which ones will mark them as fringe. This doesn't mean there's a grand conspiracy to suppress the truth. It does mean that human factors, egos, reputations, institutional inertia, shape what gets studied and how new evidence is interpreted. So we're left in an interesting position. On the one hand, there is no clear, unambiguous proof of a single, global, high-tech civilization before the known ancient world. No Ice Age Manhattan buried under the Atlantic. No definitive stone tablets from 20,000 years ago listing star coordinates. On the other hand, sites like Göbekli Tepe, controversies like the Sphinx erosion, and the scattered underwater anomalies suggest that our picture of deep history is still incomplete, that we may be missing chapters. Keeping an open mind doesn't mean believing every hypothesis that promises a hidden world. It means holding two ideas at once. First, respecting what we do know, the timelines supported by repeated measurements, the cultures we can document, the technologies we can trace step by step. Second, acknowledging what we don't know, the lost coastlines, the unexplored seafloors, the still buried sites in regions we've barely surveyed. The lost civilization theory may or may not turn out to be true in the way its strongest advocates imagine. But as we keep digging, diving, and dating, we might find that reality is stranger and more layered than either side of the debate expects. And if the myths are even partly rooted in survivor memories, then somewhere out there, under silt, beneath waves, or hidden in forgotten valleys, the evidence of their world may still be waiting. For a moment, forget everything you think you know about dragons and serpents. Forget knights in armor, fantasy novels, movie monsters. Go back instead to a night with no light pollution, no cities, no screens, just you, your small band of relatives, and the sky. The stars are overwhelming. A river of light flows overhead. The Milky Way so bright it casts shadows on the ground. Planets drift slowly from night to night. Shooting stars slice across the darkness without warning. Once in a while, something stranger appears, a pale smudge that wasn't there before. Night after night it grows a tail. It stretches across the sky like a ghostly snake. You don't know the word comet. You don't know orbital mechanics. You just know that when this glowing serpent appears, animals act differently. The air feels wrong. A season of strange weather follows, and maybe, just once in 100 lifetimes, the sky doesn't just change, it attacks. Whether that ever actually happened in front of human eyes, we can't say for sure. But we can say this, from one end of the planet to the other, cultures who never met, who never shared languages or trade routes or religions, all told stories about the same thing. A serpent in the sky, a dragon in the heavens, a cosmic snake that brings both creation and destruction. In Mesoamerica it wore feathers. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, glides between worlds. He's not just a snake and not just a bird, but both at once. Earth and sky fused into a single being. In some stories he brings knowledge and civilization. He teaches people how to measure time, how to grow maize, how to live in balance with the cosmos. In others, he's tied to catastrophe, cycles of destruction and renewal, suns that rise on new worlds after old ones are shattered. For the Aztecs, the universe had already ended multiple times. Each sun was a world age destroyed by a different disaster. Jaguars, hurricanes, fire from the sky, floods. And winding through these cycles is the feathered serpent, the one who moves between eras associated with stars and Venus and the great clockwork of the heavens. A being who appears when worlds begin and when they end. Half a world away, in the frozen north, the serpent is not feathered but vast. The Norse called it Jörmungandr, the world's serpent. It's so enormous it encircles the earth, biting its own tail. It sleeps in the oceans, invisible most of the time, but its very existence is a threat, because when Jörmungandr finally moves, when it releases its tail and rises from the sea, the end begins. Ragnarok is not just a battle, it's a cosmic unraveling. The sky splits, stars fall, the sun turns black, the seas boil as the serpent thrashes, poison spreads across the world, gods die, giants march, mountains crack, and after the chaos, if anything survives, the world is remade. Green again, fresh again, a new sun in the sky. The serpent in the Norse imagination isn't just a monster. It's a pressure building under the surface of reality. A reminder that the calm world you know rests on something coiled and dangerous. Travel down the Nile and the serpent becomes pure darkness. The ancient Egyptians watched their sun god, Ra, sail across the sky each day in a solar boat. But when he reached the horizon and sank into the underworld, his journey wasn't peaceful. Night after night, he had to face Apophis, the great chaos serpent. Apophis isn't a mischievous trickster. He's annihilation. His goal is simple: swallow the sun, end light forever. The priests of Egypt performed rituals to help Ra in this cosmic battle. They recited spells, burned wax effigies of the serpent, tried to weaken him so dawn could come again. To the Egyptians, sunrise wasn't guaranteed. It was proof that once again the serpent had failed. Once again, order had barely held back the teeth of chaos. Across the continent in China, the dragon takes on a different role, but the same familiar shape. Chinese dragons are not the villain of the story. They're powerful, intelligent, often benevolent. They rule the rains, the rivers, the storms. They coil through the clouds, bring life to the fields, or sweep them away. Flood myths in China often feature dragons churning rivers out of their banks, reshaping landscapes, drowning entire valleys. Some legends link dragons to eclipses. A celestial dragon tries to devour the sun or the moon, and people beat drums, clang pots, shout into the sky to drive it away. Once again, a serpent-like being threatens the lights of heaven, and human voices rise in answer, tiny but determined. Go south, into the ancient stories of Australia, and the pattern appears again. Aboriginal cultures across the continent tell of the rainbow serpent, a colossal being that moved across the land in the dreaming, carving out rivers, lakes, and mountains. Its body shaped the very geography. It created waterholes and made the land habitable. But the rainbow serpent isn't just a gentle creator. In many traditions, it punishes those who break sacred laws. It can unleash floods, swallow people, bring drought or deluge. Creation and destruction in one being. A serpent tied to water, to storms, to the cycles that make life possible, and can also wipe it away. In India, the serpent doesn't encircle the world, it holds it. Shisha, the cosmic serpent, lies beneath reality itself. The earth rests on his coils. In some tellings, he floats on the cosmic ocean, supporting the god Vishnu while the universe cycles through creation and dissolution. When Shisha shifts, entire worlds tremble. When he finally lets go, this version of existence ends. Here, the serpent is both foundation and terminator, the thing that keeps everything stable until the moment it doesn't. When you line these myths up side by side, Quetzalcoatl in the Mesoamerican sky, Jörmungandr in Norse seas, Apophis attacking the Egyptian sun, Chinese dragons ruling storms and eclipses, the rainbow serpent flooding Australia, Shesha coiled under the Hindu cosmos. It starts to feel like more than coincidence. Why serpents? Why dragons? Why endless, sinuous beings linked to the sky, the waters, the end of worlds? Some explanations are simple. Snakes are universal. Almost every environment on Earth has them. They're dangerous, mysterious, silent. They shed their skins and seem reborn. They move like living rivers. It makes sense that humans everywhere would see them as powerful symbols, connecting death and rebirth, danger and renewal. But there's another possibility, one that lives in that hazy space between science and speculation. Imagine a bright object appearing in the night, not a point of light like a star, but a glowing core with a tail that grows longer each evening. A tail that can span a quarter of the sky, half the sky, sometimes the whole dome of heaven. Pale, twisting, feathered at the edges like smoke or scales or wings. A comet. We know ancient people saw them. Chinese astronomers recorded broom stars for millennia. Babylonian and Greek observers tracked their paths. Even today, when a great comet appears, people feel an ancient shiver. It looks wrong, like the sky has grown a wound. Now imagine seeing not just one, but several across generations. Some harmless, some coinciding with strange weather, failed crops, maybe even local disasters. And if, deep in prehistory, a truly catastrophic impact ever did occur, if a fragment of ice and rock ever exploded in the atmosphere with the force of many nuclear weapons, turning the sky into fire and the rivers into steam, how would your descendants talk about it? They wouldn't write equations. They would tell stories. Stories of a serpent in the sky whose appearance meant the end of an age, a dragon whose breath was fire raining from the heavens, a cosmic snake that circled the world, lay coiled beneath it, or tried each night to swallow the sun. We cannot prove that every serpent myth on Earth is a memory of comets. The evidence isn't that neat. Symbolism is messy. Cultures are complex, and sometimes a snake is just a snake. But when you lie back and imagine that dark ancient sky, when you picture your ancestors watching a luminous, twisting tail stretch from horizon to horizon, the idea that they might have called it a serpent doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels almost inevitable. If you listen carefully to the oldest stories humans tell, you notice something strange. None of them talk as if this is the first world. Not really. Again and again, across continents and millennia, people insist that there were worlds before this one, worlds that rose, flourished, and then ended. Not in a vague, metaphorical way, ended by fire, by water, by darkness, by the sky itself going wrong. The Maya of Mesoamerica tracked time with a precision that still baffles modern astronomers. Their long-count calendar doesn't just measure years or centuries. It stretches over thousands of years in nested cycles, like gears in some invisible cosmic machine. In their tradition, we're living in the latest of a series of world ages. The current age is only one in a line of creations and destructions. Earlier worlds were brought into being, populated, judged, and finally wiped away when they failed some divine standard. Mayan scribes carved this idea into stone. Time isn't a straight line marching from past to future. It's a vast circle, or more accurately, circles within circles. Each great cycle has a beginning and an end, a dawn and a dusk. And at the end of each age something happens, something big enough to reset everything. On the other side of the world, in ancient India, Hindu philosophers imagined time on an even more unimaginable scale. They spoke of yugas, immense cosmic ages stretching over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. Satya Yuga, the golden age of truth and harmony. Treta and Dvapara, ages of gradual decline. And finally Kali Yuga, the age of conflict, ignorance, and moral decay. According to this scheme, the universe breathes in and out. A full cycle of yugas, called a Mahayuga, repeats endlessly. Worlds are created, sustained, and then dissolved, not once, but over and over. The end of a cycle is not just a spiritual metaphor, it's described as a time of upheaval, floods, fire, strange signs in the sky, the collapse of order. Then, after the destruction, a new age begins, as if the universe is resetting its own clock. The timescales are so vast that they almost break the human mind. Millions of years of rise and fall, written down by people living in ancient cities along Indian rivers. Did they simply imagine these spans by stacking zeros on sacred numbers? Or were they trying, with the only tools they had, to encode a dim memory that the world had ended before, and might end again? Travel to ancient Greece and you find another version of the same idea. Hesiod, one of the earliest Greek poets, described the ages of man. First came the Golden Age, when humans lived like gods. No work, no death as we know it, no suffering. Then the Silver Age, still blessed but less perfect. Then the Bronze Age, harsh and warlike. Then the Age of Heroes, when semi-divine figures strode the earth. And finally the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, an age of toil, injustice and decline. For the Greeks, history wasn't a single climb from primitive to advanced. It was a falling away from some lost perfection. And while their stories don't always describe full planetary wipeouts, the way the Maya or Hindus do, the pattern is strikingly similar. A sequence of qualitatively different worlds, each separated by some kind of boundary event. A flood sent by Zeus, a fire from heaven. In myth after myth, world orders do not fade gently. They stop. Among the Hopi people of the American Southwest, elders tell of worlds before this one with a clarity that's hard to ignore. According to Hopi tradition, we are currently in the fourth world. The first world was destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by a great flood. Each time a small number of people were warned. Each time a remnant survived, climbing into safety, retreating underground, or being led to new land as the old world failed. For the Hopi, these aren't just campfire stories. They're part of a living prophetic tradition. The end of each world isn't random. It comes when humans forget their responsibilities, neglect their rituals, disturb the balance with nature and the cosmos. And each time the method of destruction is different. Heat, cold, water, and in some tellings, something like a shaking of the earth and sky. Move a little south into the sphere of the Aztec Empire, and you meet a closely related concept, the 5 suns. In Aztec cosmology, each sun is an age of the world, ruled by different gods and ended by a different catastrophe. One world destroyed by jaguars, another by hurricane winds that turned people into monkeys, another by fiery rain, another by floods that transformed survivors into fish. We live, they said, under the 5th sun, and like the others, it too will eventually end. The details differ between the stories, but the structure is fixed: creation, flourishing, moral or cosmic imbalance, and then sudden destruction. Different continents, different languages, different pantheons of gods, but almost identically shaped timelines. The Maya talk of multiple creations. Hindus trace enormous cycles of yugas, each ending in dissolution. Greeks lament a fall from gold to iron. Hopi elders remember 3 destroyed worlds behind the one we know. Aztec priests place us in the 5th attempt at a stable cosmos. Somewhere in this overlapping map of myths is a quiet but thunderous claim. This is not the first world, not the first real attempt at a stable human era, not the first time the sky has looked down on cities, villages, families, and then watched them vanish. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to shrug and say these are just metaphors for social change or psychological stories about mortality. And they are that in part, but they're oddly specific about elements. Fire from above, water rising beyond anything a normal flood could explain, periods of darkness, unusual behavior of the sun, the stars, and the planets. Ancient sky watchers were not casual stargazers. They were obsessive. They tracked solstices and equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the wandering of planets against the backdrop of fixed stars. Some, like the Maya and the priests of ancient India, seem to have noticed cycles so long that they're hard to track in a single lifetime. Precession of the equinoxes, long-term shifts in where constellations rise and set. When you're watching the sky that carefully, certain patterns start to emerge. Stars drift. Constellations slowly slide along the horizon over thousands of years. Sometimes comets appear on schedules that are long but regular. Meteor showers repeat. Even catastrophic events like close passes of large objects might have rhythms on geological timescales. We don't know exactly what ancient astronomers understood. We can't ask them what they noticed and what they feared. But we can say this. Over and over, they frame time itself as cyclical. Not just the cycle of seasons or human life, but vast cycles where entire ages begin and end. Many of them tied those cycles to the sky, to positions of stars and planets, to grand cosmic clocks we're still deciphering. Maybe they were projecting human hopes and fears onto the heavens. Maybe they were encoding dim cultural memories of real disasters in the language of gods and demons. Or maybe, just maybe, they had glimpsed something true about how often the universe resets the stage. Whatever the case, the message echoes across the ruins and the oral traditions, across stone calendars and sung prophecies. Worlds are not permanent. Ages end. And those who happen to survive carry the memory forward, wrapped in myth, waiting for future generations to ask whether the cycle might one day begin again. The strange thing about these world-ending stories is that they rarely end with everyone dying. They almost always end with a handful of people being spared for a reason. Not just the righteous or the lucky or the strong. Again and again the myths emphasize something else. They were the ones who knew. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim is warned of the flood, not because he's the best farmer or the greatest warrior, but because he has a special relationship with the God of wisdom. In the Bible, Noah isn't just a shipbuilder. He walks with God, receives precise measurements, follows exact instructions. In Mesoamerica, survivors are often priests or sages who remember the count of days. In India, Manu is given not just a warning of the flood, but teachings about law, order, and cosmic cycles. Across cultures separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, the pattern repeats. The people who survive the cataclysm are often custodians of knowledge, timekeepers, star watchers, ritual specialists, the ones who remember how the world works. If this was only one story, we could brush it off as coincidence. But when this same motif shows up on different continents, embedded in different religions, carried through different languages, it raises a question. Were ancient cultures trying to tell us that when the world nearly ended, the most valuable thing to save wasn't gold or animals or even tools? It was information. Think about what your bottleneck ancestors had already learned. Over unimaginable stretches of time, they had worked out how seasons shift, how animals migrate, how plants ripen, how the sky changes night by night. They didn't have telescopes or computers, but they had something just as powerful. They had patience. Generation after generation of people staring at the stars, tracing the patterns, noticing that some stars wander, some repeat their paths, Some vanish behind the sun and then return. They realize that the sky isn't random. It has a rhythm, a heartbeat. Now imagine that rhythm being interrupted by a catastrophe. A comet appears where nothing should be. A new light grows brighter every night. Or the familiar stars vanish behind smoke and dust. The moon glows a bloody red. The sun fails to rise properly for weeks. If you had been watching the heavens your entire life, if your parents and grandparents had taught you that the sky is the great clock of existence, how would that feel? It wouldn't just be terrifying. It would be a revelation. The sky can change, and if it can change once, it can change again. Many researchers think this is exactly why so many ancient myths are soaked in astronomy. The gods are planets. The monsters are comets and eclipses. The world tree is the axis of the sky. The serpent is the winding path of something bright and dangerous crossing the heavens. You see it in the stories, but you also see it carved into stone. Cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other built monuments that double as star machines. The pyramids at Giza aligning with Orion's belt. The megaliths at Nabta Playa lining up with solstices long before Stonehenge was built. The temples of Angkor rising in a pattern that echoes the constellation Draco. The Maya building observatories so precise they could predict eclipses centuries in advance. From a modern perspective, lining up a building with a star might seem like a neat aesthetic choice, but in a world that had already ended once, this could have been something else. A safety protocol. If the last catastrophe was linked to something in the sky, a rogue object, a particular alignment, a repeating cycle, then tracking the heavens becomes a survival strategy. You don't just build a house. You build a calendar in stone, a memory that can't be lost if your priests die, your libraries burn, your cities sink under mud and ash. This is where the figure of the priest, the shaman, the wisdom keeper takes on a different light. In many ancient societies, these people weren't just religious officials, they were walking hard drives, human repositories of star charts, plant lore, migration routes, medicinal recipes, ritual sequences. They memorized vast bodies of information using rhythm, song, and story, because writing was rare or non-existent. Their job wasn't only to talk to the gods, their job was to remember. Remember where the safe high ground is. Remember what happened the last time the river rose too high. Remember that when that bright star appears with a tail, it's time to leave the lowlands. In some traditions, this knowledge wasn't shared with everyone. It was encoded, restricted, hidden behind layers of symbolism. Egyptian priesthoods guarding sacred numbers. Vedic rishis transmitting complex astronomical cycles as mantras. Mesoamerican daykeepers holding the key to calendars that stretched back thousands of years. Mystery schools, elite priestly colleges, secret societies. These might not just have been about philosophical enlightenment or spiritual status. They may have been covert disaster management programs, training a small number of people to carry the most crucial information through times of chaos. And those obsessions you see in ancient cultures with calendars that stretch far into the past and future. The 26,000-year precessional cycle noticed by different civilizations. The long counts that measure not just years but cosmic ages. The insistence that history moves in repeating patterns. Yugas, suns, worlds destroyed and remade. If your ancestors had once watched the world almost end, and had survived only because a few people remembered what the sky had looked like before it happened, you'd probably become obsessed with time too. You would track it with everything you had. Stones, shadows, temples, pyramids, entire cities. The alignments become less mysterious when you imagine them as instruments. A temple doorway that frames the rising sun on the solstice, a yearly system check. A pyramid shaft aimed at a particular star, a way to know if precession has shifted the heavens enough to signal the turning of a great cycle. A stone circle that marks lunar standstills, an ancient dashboard tracking the more subtle wobbles in Earth's motion. To us, these feel like curiosities. To them, they may have been warnings written in architecture, messages to the future saying, "Pay attention to this star. When it rises here, the cycle is turning. Watch this point on the horizon. When the sun returns to this gate, remember what we told you. Don't forget what happened last time." We can't prove that any given monument was built as a catastrophe alarm. Archaeology is cautious by design, and the evidence is fragmentary. But the convergence is hard to ignore. Myths of world-ending floods and fires, priestly castes obsessed with tracking the sky, megaliths and temples aligned with uncanny precision, calendar systems that reach far beyond the needs of farming or taxation. Taken together, they hint at a possibility. After the last great crisis, survivors may have looked at their fragile growing populations and realized something profound. Bodies can be replaced in a few generations, but knowledge cannot. Lose the story of what happened, lose the memory of how the sky behaved, lose the warnings encoded in cycles, and the next time the pattern repeats, you won't be ready. So they did the only thing they could. They buried their memories in the most durable medium they knew: stone, ritual, story. They trained specialists to guard those memories. They wrapped them in religion and myth so people would keep repeating them, century after century, even when no one quite remembered why. They turned catastrophe into cosmology, disaster into doctrine. And somewhere beneath the layers of symbolism and sacred language, a simple, urgent message may still be hiding. It happened before. It can happen again. Watch the sky. Modern science likes clear lines. Data on one side, stories on the other. Facts in the lab, myths around the campfire. For most of the last 2 centuries, researchers treated ancient tales of floods and fire and falling skies as nothing more than folklore. Interesting, maybe even beautiful, but not reliable. Certainly not evidence. But the more closely we study both the Earth and the past, the more that neat division starts to blur. The rocks and the stories keep pointing to the same places, again and again. This is where ancient memory meets modern science, and things get strange. Think about those bottleneck survivors, the people who learned that losing knowledge could be more deadly than losing food. They became obsessive about teaching. They repeated the same stories night after night because forgetting them meant dying. Over tens of thousands of years, this did something to human culture. It turned memory itself into a survival tool. For a long time, scholars assumed that oral traditions could only stay accurate for a few generations before being twisted beyond recognition. But newer research is challenging that idea. In some cases, oral traditions appear to preserve real events across not just centuries but 10 millennia or more. One of the clearest examples lives in Australia. Aboriginal cultures there maintain some of the oldest continuous traditions on Earth. For thousands of years, their ancestors watched the coastlines, fished the estuaries, camped near the rivers that met the sea. They also watched the sea itself rise. Modern sea level data tells us that between about 18,000 and 7,000 years ago, the oceans climbed more than 120 meters as the last ice age ended. Shorelines moved inland, sometimes by tens of kilometers. Whole coastal plains vanished beneath the waves. Aboriginal stories describe this in detail. In some traditions, elders recount how the sea came in, swallowing hunting grounds, drowning sacred sites, turning freshwater inlets into salty bays. In others, they mark where the shoreline used to be, pointing far out beyond the modern coast. Certain narratives even remember specific hills that became islands and river mouths that turned into deep channels. Geologists went to check. They mapped submerged landscapes, modelled glacial melt rates, reconstructed ancient coastlines. In multiple regions, the stories and the models lined up almost perfectly. The places that oral traditions identified as old land now lie underwater at depths that match sea levels from roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The implication is unsettlingly simple. In some cases, communities may have preserved accurate memories of real environmental changes for more than 300 generations, not as dry records, as sacred narrative. If that's possible for rising seas, what about other events? Floods, fires in the sky, sudden darkness. Could some of those myths be echoes of real catastrophes, filtered through ritual and symbol, but still anchored to something that actually happened? That question sits at the heart of one of the more controversial ideas in this space, the Tolman hypothesis. In the early 1990s, two Austrian geologists, Alexander and Edith Tolman, proposed that a large comet approached Earth in prehistoric times and broke into several pieces before impact. They suggested 7 main fragments, each slamming into different parts of the globe. According to their reconstruction, this could have triggered massive tsunamis, global fires, abrupt climate disruptions, exactly the kind of world-ending chaos that fills ancient stories. They went further. The Tolmans tried to line up these hypothetical impacts with myths from cultures around the world. The sky cracking open, stars falling, the sea rising, weeks of darkness, a rain of burning stones. In their view, many of those myths weren't pure invention. They were distorted yet persistent memories of a real cometary disaster. Most scientists thought they had gone too far. The geological evidence they presented was debatable. The proposed timing didn't fit cleanly with established climate records. Their attempt to match specific myths to specific impact sites felt forced. The hypothesis never gained mainstream acceptance, but it did something important. It forced researchers to look harder at two things: the physical signatures of cosmic impacts and the possibility that myth might preserve some memory of them. In the decades since, impact science has advanced dramatically. We've identified more craters, more microtectites, more layers of unusual materials that hint at past encounters with objects from space. At the same time, a different line of evidence was quietly emerging from an entirely separate field: plasma physics. High-energy plasma, electrified gas, behaves in strange ways in strong electric and magnetic fields. In laboratory experiments, when powerful electrical discharges are run through plasma, they create shapes, pinched filaments, hourglasses, spirals, stick figure forms with outstretched arms and heads flaring like suns. Those shapes looked oddly familiar. All over the world, from the American Southwest to Northern Europe, from the Sahara to Australia, ancient people carved and painted peculiar figures into rock. Radiant stick figures, spiky discs, twisting serpents across the sky, concentric circles with rays, ladders reaching upward. For a long time, archaeologists saw them as stylized humans, spirits, suns, or ritual symbols, and they probably were. Symbolism doesn't vanish just because something begins with observation. But some plasma physicists noticed that many of these petroglyphs match the specific, rare shapes that intense auroral phenomena and electrical discharges could produce in the upper atmosphere during periods of extreme solar activity or cosmic disturbance. Not just in general outline, in detail. The idea, still controversial but increasingly discussed, is that our ancestors may have witnessed highly unusual sky events, massive structured auroras, electrical storms on a planetary scale, perhaps triggered by solar outbursts or interactions with passing debris in space. They then did what humans do best. They encoded the memory in art and story. They turned terrifying plasma structures into serpents, gods, dragons, cosmic warriors, world trees. Again, We're in the grey zone between data and speculation. The laboratory discharges are real. The resemblance to ancient rock art is real. Whether they're directly connected is still debated. But the conversation has changed. Instead of dismissing ancient sky serpent stories as pure fantasy, some scientists are asking, what exactly were they seeing? This shift in attitude is part of a broader movement in the sciences, taking mythology seriously, not as literal, word-for-word historical record, but as a potential carrier of information about real events, encoded, exaggerated, ritualized, but not necessarily invented from nothing. There's now a name for this approach: geomythology. Geomythology sits at the intersection of geology, archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology. Practitioners look for patterns where myths, place names, and traditional stories line up with physical evidence in the landscape. A tale about a mountain that once blew its top is compared with volcanic deposits and eruption dates. A legend of a great wave that swallowed a village is checked against tsunami sediments and coastal subsidence. A story about a sun that didn't rise for days is weighed against ice core data, volcanic aerosols, or evidence of distant impacts. We know, for instance, that some Native American stories appear to describe volcanic eruptions that occurred thousands of years ago, including details about lava flows and ash falls that match the geological record. Legends in the Pacific Northwest refer to a bridge of the gods collapsing, a myth that may preserve a memory of a massive landslide that dammed and then reshaped a river system. Greek tales of Phaethon losing control of the sun chariot have been loosely associated with unusual celestial events. Each case is debated, but the pattern is consistent. Stories sometimes point to real geological episodes. When legend and laboratory evidence begin to converge, something profound happens. The past stops being a simple timeline of anonymous events and becomes a conversation between memory and matter. Rock layers tell us what happened. Myths may hint at what it felt like. For the mystery of the world-ending event remembered in so many cultures, this convergence is especially important. Rising seas in Aboriginal lore match post-Ice Age data. Petroglyphs of sky serpents resemble plasma forms reproduced in modern labs. Flood myths echo mega-tsunami deposits in certain regions. Darkened sun stories coincide, at least roughly, with evidence for large eruptions and abrupt climate downturns. None of this proves a single global catastrophe. It doesn't prove that a comet shattered into 7 pieces and rewrote human history in one terrible day. But it does force a reconsideration. If oral traditions can preserve details of sea level rise over 10,000 years, if rock art across continents echoes the rare patterns of high-energy plasma, if multiple, independent lines of scientific evidence keep circling back to the same types of disasters our ancestors swore had happened, then dismissing their stories outright starts to look less like skepticism and more like a different kind of superstition, a modern one, the belief that only written records and instruments can carry truth. Somewhere between the certainty of the lab and the poetry of myth lies a narrow path. Geomythology walks that path, one story and one rock layer at a time, asking a quiet, unsettling question. What if the ancients were trying to warn us as accurately as they knew how about things the Earth does, and sometimes will do again? First, the simple one that isn't simple at all. If the evidence for repeated global catastrophes is building, if ice cores and crater fields and nanodiamonds and black mats in the soil are all whispering the same story as the myths, why isn't this what we're taught in school? Part of the answer is inertia. Once a story about the past gets written into textbooks, it becomes heavy. It resists being moved. For over a century, the dominant story has been slow change, gentle evolution, gradual progress. No sudden global floods, no firestorms from the sky. No world-ending nights of darkness. Catastrophes were for legends, not for respectable science. Another part is discomfort. If historians and scientists accept that our planet sometimes goes through sudden, violent resets, it changes the tone of human history. It stops being a steady climb towards civilization and becomes something scarier, a story of fragile cultures growing in the brief calm between disasters. That's not a narrative that makes people feel safe. It doesn't sell the idea that the future will look like a smoother, shinier version of the present. So we leave the uncomfortable bits to specialists, to fringe journals, to late-night discussions, not to public education. But there's a deeper reason. If you allow the possibility that a truly global civilization existed before the last great catastrophes, even for a moment, everything begins to wobble. Imagine what it would mean if a networked, maritime, sky-watching culture really had spanned coastlines and river valleys around the world before the ice melted and the oceans rose. Not necessarily a civilization of satellites and smartphones, but of stone, copper, and maybe even early iron. Harbours now drowned hundreds of meters below sea level. Cities built on continental shelves that are today the seafloor. Libraries not of paper, but of carved stone, oral tradition, and careful alignments of monuments with stars and solstices. If that civilization existed, our timeline fractures. The firsts we pride ourselves on, first cities, first writing, first agriculture, might be second attempts, or third. What we think of as the beginning of history might be the beginning of recovery. The re-emergence of knowledge, not its birth. It would also mean something else. If they were advanced enough to chart the sky precisely, to predict seasons, maybe even to notice long, slow cycles in the motions of comets and meteor streams, then their myths might not just be memories, they might be warnings. Because woven through flood stories and fire from heaven traditions is a quiet, chilling question. Could it all happen again? Ancient texts hint that it can. They talk about world ages that end not once but repeatedly, about previous suns destroyed by water, by fire, by wind, by darkness, about gods who return after a long count of years, bringing chaos in their wake. Mythic language, yes, but mythic language encoding something they thought was regular, cyclical, predictable enough to fear in advance. Here is where modern astronomy quietly re-enters the story. Because our planet doesn't drift through empty space. It moves through a cosmic environment shaped by old collisions, broken comets, and lingering debris. One of the most important of those debris fields is the Taurid meteor stream. Every year, like clockwork, Earth plows through the Taurids twice, in late spring and late autumn. Most years it's a mild display, a few slow, bright shooting stars, pretty but harmless. But astronomers now suspect the Taurid stream isn't just dust and pebbles. Nested inside it may be swarms of much larger objects, kilometre-scale fragments of a giant comet that began breaking apart tens of thousands of years ago. If that's true, then sometimes, not every year, not even every century, but on long, slow cycles, Earth's orbit lines up with denser, more dangerous clusters inside the stream. During those encounters, the night sky could suddenly come alive with enormous fireballs, airbursts and impacts. Enough to set forests ablaze on a continental scale. Enough to send tsunamis racing across oceans. Enough to make the myths feel very literal. This idea is still controversial. Some researchers argue the Taurids are just a pretty meteor shower with no hidden monsters. Others point to patterns in impact craters, tree ring damage, and glassy impact materials that seem to cluster around periods when the Taurids would have been especially active. Again, we're in that uncomfortable borderland between what we know and what we're just beginning to suspect. But even without the Taurids, we know something else. Near-Earth objects pass us all the time. Many of them are only discovered after they've already flown by. Every few years, an asteroid the size of a bus or a house zips past closer than the moon, unnoticed by almost everyone. Occasionally, something larger appears without warning. In 2013, a rock about 20 meters across exploded over Chelyabinsk, Russia. It arrived from the direction of the sun, nearly invisible to telescopes. It detonated with the energy of a small nuclear weapon. Windows shattered in thousands of buildings. Over 1,000 people were injured by flying glass. And that was tiny, a cosmic pebble. Scale that up 10-fold, 100-fold, and you begin to enter the territory of the stories, the territory of forests flattened, skies darkened, coasts rewritten. Most of these dear misses never make front pages. They're brief bulletins in technical circulars, quiet updates in orbital databases. The public rarely hears. Life goes on, but the sky we think of as peaceful is busier and less predictable than we're comfortable admitting. So we circle back to the ancients, to cultures that tracked the heavens with obsessive care, that built temples aligned to specific stars and points on the horizon, that carved serpent shapes and flaming discs and descending gods into stone, always with the same themes, cycles, returns, endings, rebirths. What were they trying so hard not to forget? Maybe it was simple. The world is not as stable as it seems. It can change overnight. Maybe it was more specific. In certain seasons, in certain ages, the sky becomes dangerous. Watch the stars, count the years. When the signs return, move inland, move uphill. Or perhaps the warning was about us, not the sky. Civilizations are fragile. Arrogance is fatal. Do not assume that your walls, your machines, your knowledge will protect you from water and fire and stone. Remember the last time. Remember what we lost. This leaves us with one final uneasy thought. The line between myth, memory, and prophecy is not as clear as we like to think. A flood story can be all three at once. A story of what did happen, told as a sacred tale of gods and heroes, a memory passed down so it won't fade, and a prophecy, because the storyteller knows the cycle will turn again, even if the listeners don't live to see it. As you drift towards sleep, you stand on that thin line too, between a safe, steady story of the past and a stranger one in which we've been here before, in which other peoples, other civilizations, once watched the same sky, felt the same fragile security, and tried to send a message forward through the dark. The uncomfortable questions are simple. What if they succeeded? What if we're the ones who've forgotten how to listen? So now we step back. We've walked through floods that drowned whole landscapes, skies that went dark, fire that seemed to fall from the stars, serpents in the heavens, world ages turning like a cosmic clock, survivors stumbling out of ruins with one task: remember. And when you lay those stories side by side, something strange happens. Patterns start to line up. Over and over, cultures that never met, cultures separated by oceans and by tens of thousands of years, tell you the same things, that the world was destroyed not once, but in cycles, that the cause was often water, sometimes fire, sometimes both, that the sky itself changed, tilted, darkened, or seemed to fall, that a few people or a chosen group hid in mountains, caves, boats, or underground refugees and survived, that they emerged carrying special knowledge, rules for how to live, warnings about what would happen if we forgot. You can dismiss one story as coincidence, maybe two. But when the same motifs repeat in Sumer and India, in Mesoamerica and Scandinavia, in Australia and the Pacific, the coincidence starts to feel heavy. Historians, anthropologists, mythologists, they all wrestle with the same puzzle. Why does everybody remember the world ending? There are three big explanations. The first is psychological. Humans everywhere have the same basic brain, the same fears, the same needs. You live in a small, vulnerable community surrounded by forces you can't control: storms, earthquakes, droughts, volcanoes, disease. So your mind reaches for big stories, stories that make sense of chaos, stories that say, the world might be terrifying, but it's not random. There's a reason, there's a pattern. You imagine a flood not just because floods happen, but because water is the ultimate eraser. It wipes the slate clean. It's the perfect symbol for starting over. You imagine fire from the sky because lightning, meteors, volcanic ash all blur together in the dark corners of memory. They become one terrifying image, the heavens themselves turning against you. You imagine serpents because snakes are old enemies, deeply wired into your nervous system. You see twisting comets, auroras, or meteor trails, and your brain says, snake, dragon, serpent in the sky. In this view, the similarities don't require a shared event. They just require a shared nervous system. The stories are reflections in the same mirror. The second explanation is diffusion. Humans travel. Even in the deep past, your ancestors weren't standing still. Bands migrated, traded, intermarried. They met at seasonal gathering spots, at river crossings, in mountain passes. And when they met, they didn't just swap obsidian blades and shells. They swapped stories. A powerful myth can spread like a virus. One group survives a terrible flood, creates a story to explain it, and passes that story to their neighbors. Those neighbors adjust it, add their own gods, their own landscapes, but the core structure remains. Over centuries, as people move and split and resettle, the myth travels with them, changing and staying the same at the same time. In this view, you don't need global catastrophe. You just need one big regional trauma, a few charismatic storytellers, and enough time. The myth rides the waves of migration until it appears in places that look disconnected on a modern map, but are actually linked by long-forgotten chains of contact. The third explanation is the one that keeps people awake at night. The possibility that at least some of these stories are memories of real, global-scale events. Massive sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, sudden climate swings, mega floods triggered by glacial lakes bursting, ocean currents reorganizing, maybe even a comet or asteroid impact that destabilized the climate, kicked up wildfires and darkened the sky for years. In this view, the ancients aren't just making metaphors. They're doing what your bottleneck ancestors did around those life-saving fires. They're encoding hard-earned survival knowledge in stories so that it doesn't die when they do. Once, the ice melted and the waters rose. Once, the sky grew dark and the crops failed. Once, fire fell and the forest burned. This happened. It can happen again. Remember. These three explanations are often presented as competitors, as if you have to pick one. But real history is rarely that clean. The truth might be that all three are working together. Human psychology shapes the symbols, the flood, the fire, the serpent, the cycle. Real disasters provide the raw material: tsunamis, megastorms, volcanic winters, sudden droughts. And diffusion spreads and mutates the stories across continents and millennia, weaving them into each culture's language, religion, and identity. In this hybrid picture, myths are like fossils, part imagination, part geology, part social transmission. You can't always separate which layer is which, but the overall structure still tells you something important. Our ancestors lived through things so extreme, so shattering, that the only way to handle them was to turn them into sacred story. And that's the humbling part. When you listen closely, you realize you're not just hearing bedtime tales. You're hearing echoes of survival. People huddled in caves while ash fell for weeks, Parents watching rivers swallow familiar shorelines. Hunters returning to find their hunting grounds turned into lakes. Farmers looking up at a sun dimmed behind dust and smoke, wondering if it would ever shine the same way again. They didn't just endure those traumas, they carried them. They folded them into the fabric of who they were. They swore, explicitly or implicitly, that the story would not be lost. So they told it around fires, in whispering voices after dark, while children drifted towards sleep, listening without quite understanding, while elders repeated the same phrases again and again until they were etched into memory. The world was destroyed once. Here's how we survived. Here's what we did wrong. Here's what the sky looked like. Here's the sign you must watch for. Don't forget. Don't ever forget. Those fireside repetitions are why we're talking about it now, across tens of thousands of years, across language shifts and migrations, across extinctions and cataclysms. The signal never fully died. It weakened, it distorted, it merged with local legends, but it never went out. And in the last few decades, something new has joined the circle around the fire. Modern science. Glaciologists drilling ice cores that record ancient atmospheres. Geologists reading flood deposits like pages in a book. Astronomers mapping past comet streams. Geneticists tracing population bottlenecks and expansions in your DNA. Archaeologists finding coastal ruins drowned by post-ice age sea level rise. Paleoclimatologists reconstructing sudden temperature spikes and drops. Piece by piece they're building a picture of a planet that has not been gentle. A planet that has flipped, abruptly, between different climate states. A planet that has, more than once, overwhelmed the civilizations living on its surface. Will they ever prove, beyond doubt, that a specific myth describes a specific event? Maybe, maybe not. They might find a crater dated to the exact window of a legendary darkness. They might match a known megaflood to a remembered deluge. Or they might only ever find suggestive overlaps, timelines that line up too neatly to ignore, but not neatly enough to satisfy everyone. Either way, the investigation matters, because at its core, this mystery isn't just about whether a comet hit, or how high the waters rose. It's about what kind of species we are. We are the descendants of people who stared down world-ending forces and refused to let the story stop with them. People who learned, in the harshest possible way, that survival isn't just about food and shelter. It's about memory, about warning, about passing on what you know to those who come after. When you trace these myths across time and space, you're really tracing the outline of that commitment, the commitment your ancestors made to you long before you were born, to remember, to talk and listen and teach, to sit beside the fire, whether it's burning wood or an electric screen, or the quiet glow of a late-night voice, and tell the next generation, this is what happened, this is what might happen again, this is who we are because of what we survived. In that sense, the impossible coincidence that haunts historians isn't just a riddle about the past, it's a mirror held up to the present, a reminder that we live on a restless planet, that we carry ancient scars written in story form, and that somewhere, deep in our shared memory, the world has ended before and begun again. In the end, when you pull all these threads together, something quietly astonishing appears. We started with scattered stories, a flood that drowns the world, a sky that falls and goes dark, fire that rains from above, serpents that coil across the heavens and mark the turning of the world ages. At first they look like myths, like bedtime stories for ancient children. But when you listen closely, when you set them side by side, a pattern starts to emerge. Different languages, different gods, different landscapes, but the same memory, echoing again and again. Maybe the ancients were trying to do what your bottleneck ancestors once did around the fire. Preserve knowledge in the only way that couldn't be easily lost. Wrap it in story. Bury it in ritual. Hide warnings inside songs and sacred calendars so that even if cities fell and scripts were forgotten, the core message might survive. Not as data, as meaning. Across continents, separated by oceans and millennia, they seem to be saying the same few things. The world is not guaranteed to stay the way it is. Seas can rise, skies can darken, fire and stone can fall from above. Whole ages can end. Survival is never an accident. The ones who live through catastrophe are the ones who prepare, who observe the sky and the seasons, who notice when patterns begin to break, the ones who cooperate when fear pushes others apart, the ones who remember what happened last time. And perhaps most important of all, you are not alone in this story. Every human alive is part of a chain of survivors that stretches back through ice and fire, flood and famine, darkness and dawn. Whether your ancestors told their stories in deserts, in rainforests, on islands, or on frozen steppe, they were watching the same heavens. They were listening to the same earth. That's the quiet power of these myths. They don't just connect us to some possible ancient catastrophe. They connect us to each other. When a Polynesian navigator tells of a world-consuming wave, when a Mesopotamian scribe records a deluge, when a First Nations elder speaks of the sky turning to ash, they're all adding verses to the same long human memory, a memory that belongs to you, too. If your family, your culture, your region has its own story of a great flood, a long darkness, a fiery serpent in the sky, I'd love for you to share it. Pass it on the way your ancestors once did. Write it in the comments so others can hear it, learn from it, and maybe recognize pieces of their own traditions inside yours. And if this journey through forgotten ages and half-remembered disasters has stirred your curiosity, you can stay with us as we keep exploring. There are so many more shadows between history and myth, so many more questions hidden in old stones and older stories. If you'd like to hear more of them, you can gently tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next time we wander into the dark corners of the past together. You can also leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. A quiet little map of night listeners, scattered across the planet our ancestors almost lost. For now, you can let the details drift to the edges of your mind. Just hold on to the simple thing the ancients never wanted us to forget. The world has ended before in ways big and small. But every time, someone endured, someone watched the sky, remembered the signs, kept the stories, and carried life forward. You are part of that unbroken line. Rest with that thought. Let the old fears, the ancient fires and floods grow distant. What remains is the resilience that brought you here, to this quiet moment at the end of a long, long story. Sleep well, descendant of survivors. We'll pick up the next mystery next time